players with potential to be league winners or even just really, really good in fantasy football. They've got massive opportunity in front of them. Either they're going to be in a new offense or there's a vacancy left behind in their current offense. Just last season, we saw players like Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, Rashad White, Raheem Mostert, Nico Collins, Rasheed Rice, Sam Laporta, Jake Ferguson. So many players that got opportunities in front of them, whether they were veterans or rookies, and they were able to help you win a fantasy football championship. So Dave Kluge, you and I, we're going to take a look at some of these players that we have identified as not only just good draft values, but we actually like them for fantasy football. It's not just a player with an opportunity that we're like, they could be okay. We actually like these guys. So why don't you start us off here? This one I think is very interesting because you're going with rookie quarterback Caleb Williams.
Yeah, and as a Bears fan, it's so hard for me not to sip the Kool-Aid too hard because I've done this in the offseason before and I don't want to do it again. But
You're
the
chugging the
stars
Kool-Aid, my friend. You're not sipping right now. You're chugging.
I don't think I am. I really
Okay.
don't. I think everybody else is kind of chugging the Kool-Aid. You look right now, he's getting drafted as the QB1 off the board in fantasy. People are really pushing him up draft boards, but it's really hard not to see the high-end range of outcomes here, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to bore you with all the numbers and metrics. Caleb Williams, one of the best prospects we've seen in recent history. You look through the years and you can kind of put him up there with the Andrew Luck, Peyton Manning, John Elway, Cam Newton type of guys that have come into the league as rookies. In 2022, he won the Heisman, he won the Walter Camp Award, won the Maxwell Award for the best player in college football, unanimous All-American, all of those sorts of things. In 2023, he saw a little bit of a dip in his overall numbers, but he was a more efficient passer, which you like to see. Completion percentage went up, passer rating went up, yards per attempt went up, all of those sorts of things. We know that he is a quick processor. He can make just about any throw on the field. He's got good legs, and he lands in Chicago, which historically hasn't been a place that you want to see a quarterback go to rack up passing numbers. But this is a very different team than we've ever seen before. You can make the argument. I'm not going to sit here and break down every single team, but you can make the argument that the Bears are the best wide receiver trio in the league. Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, Roma Dunze. They're going to make Caleb Williams' job easier. Now you look at the opportunity here. The opportunity is there for him to have the best rookie season of all time for a passing quarterback. In 2012, Andrew Luck set the record with 4,374 yards. You can kind of see Caleb Williams pass that. Justin Herbert in 2020, 31 touchdowns, rookie record. It's not out of the range of question to think that maybe he can pass that as well. But really, the opportunity that I'm looking at here is the opportunity to be the best Bears quarterback in NFL history. Now, I'm not just talking rookie season. I'm saying the best Bears quarterback in NFL history, and he could set those numbers his rookie year. The best year we've ever seen from a quarterback in Chicago, 1995, Eric Kramer, 3,838 yards and 29 touchdowns. It is a low bar to pass, and I think Caleb Williams can do it this year.
So in terms of fantasy, though, you
Mhm.
mentioned some of those guys, Justin Herbert, Andrew Luck. As you were talking about that, I'm looking up those guys. Andrew Luck, you mentioned, throws for the most yards ever by a rookie quarterback. He was quarterback 8 that year in
Mhm.
2012. Justin Herbert throws for the most touchdowns, I believe, that's what you said.
Yep.
And Justin Herbert, quarterback 10.
Mhm.
So is that kind of why you're leaning into this? Because right now, Caleb Williams, the ADP or average draft position over on
QB12.
footballguys.com is on Football Guys, we got it at
Oh,
QB 16. Because
all right.
I know what you're referencing
Underdog
as best ball.
QB12. Yeah.
Right, right. The best ball is just gonna skew slightly. And I'm sure these ADPs will change all throughout the offseason. So let's just say it's somewhere between QB 12 to QB 16. And we're looking at a guy that I think the ceiling outcome is probably somewhere around QB 8. Is that kind of what we're getting at here, Dave?
I'll say that I think Andrew Luck, we saw him develop throughout his career as a very good rusher. And I think that when you look at the rushing skill sets for Caleb Williams and Andrew Luck, they're kind of similar. We're not looking at a guy who's going to rush for 1,000+ yards, but a guy who is sneaky athletic on his feet and can make big rushing plays. So I've said a lot that we can kind of look at the range of outcomes for Caleb Williams as a rusher to be somewhere between 500 and 800 yards. And if we get that, then we could look at a much higher ceiling. So I'd say the ceiling outcome is probably a little bit closer to QB6 or so. We saw
That's so
last year
interesting.
CJ
Okay.
Stroud finish as a top 12 quarterback with almost no rushing output at all and not as good of a group of pass catchers. So I think that the environment, the rushing output, and all of that gives us the opportunity where Caleb Williams could easily be a top 6 quarterback this year.
So this is interesting because at this point, I think you probably know more about Caleb than I do. And so my question is, this is the guy who's never rushed for 500 yards in college. So this ceiling of him potentially going for 600 yards, I'm intrigued by that because he has the ability, right? Like when we see Caleb Williams, we see that he can run around. We see that he's thickly built. This is not a guy who's very frail, and he can create outside of structure. Obviously, everyone knows that. I'm very intrigued by this. Is this something that are we seeing reports out of Bears camp that he's been a bit more mobile? You're the one that's a lot more locked in on Bears stuff here.
I'm just able to look at players, and I know this is going to be a total cop out here, but a lot of times these guys that are really efficient rushers in college, we see them rush a little bit more in the NFL. And I'm trying to pull it up right now and I'm unable to find it. Yeah, Justin Fields here. This is what I was looking for. Justin Fields, if you look at him as a rusher in college, he had 383 rushing yards his final year at
Mhm.
Ohio State. Only had one game where he rushed for over 100 yards. And I remember that offseason saying, this is a guy who could easily rush for 1,000 yards, and just people were throwing tomatoes at me from the stands, saying that I didn't know what I was talking about. He didn't rush that way in college. He can't do it in the NFL, but you see the traits that are going to translate well to the NFL. He's got the vision, he's got that ability to just shake defenders. I know we talked about that with Danny Kelly. What was that, about 2 months ago or so, where he is just an inherent runner. His ability to break tackles and make big plays on his legs is kind of, if I had to compare it to anybody, I said Andrew Luck earlier, but it's kind of Patrick Mahomes esque, where it's just he makes it look easy. He's able to brush off defenders. He's able to find those creases and just pick up big plays. So even though we didn't see a ton of that at USC, I think we could see it more at the NFL level. He's got the skills to be an elite rusher.
And we do see this quite often with quarterbacks that go from the college level to the pro level. We saw it with CJ Stroud as well. You already mentioned Justin Fields. So, yeah, I mean, hitting that number, getting to about 600 rushing yards wouldn't surprise me. I do think the opportunity there is pretty fantastic. I know Dave Richard over from CBS has been at Chicago Bears OTAs, and he's been watching, and just everything has looked phenomenal with the players on the field, with Roma Dunze out there looking like they've been playing together for years, DJ Moore getting his targets. So everything looks good. I think the one thing that he mentioned was that when they got into 11 and 11s, getting that pressure kind of threw things off a little bit. But obviously, this is a rookie quarterback. It's going to take some time. So I like this one, Dave. I think it's very interesting, and especially for those of us waiting on quarterback to draft later. I think Caleb is a really fun target in drafts. Now, before we move on, I just want to remind you guys there are tons of ways for you to enjoy our show, whether it's here on our new YouTube channel, youtube.com /@ football guys fantasy. Don't forget the at. And make sure you like and subscribe to the video. Drop a comment below this video. Share it with a friend. It's June. All right. We're not giving away all of our secrets just yet, but you could share it with your friends. Maybe not your league mates, but friends that you're not in a league with. Okay. And then for the podcast, same thing. Share that with your friends. Subscribe to the show on Apple or Spotify. And after you finish listening to the episode, please leave a review. What you like about the show, topics you'd like to see, things you'd like to see us add to this show, maybe a special guest that you want to hear from, okay? And leave that in the review. I'm going to move on to my first player that I want to talk about. And I was kind of going back and forth on this as to whether I want to trust this player, but the opportunity is just so big, Dave, and I'm just very, very intrigued by this. And it's George Pickens, the wide receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Right now, his average draft position is around the 5th round, so it's a decent investment going as the wide receiver 28. I'm so intrigued by this because this is a guy who's going to be taking over this wide receiver 1 role for the Steelers with Russell Wilson, potentially also Justin Fields at some point. We don't know. We do know that Mike Tomlin kind of likes to stick to his guys. If he has a starter, he'll stick to that starter. The worry for me, and I think for many people, is going to be Arthur Smith. What happens to this offense? We saw what happened to Drake London as the wide receiver 1 in the Arthur Smith offense, but at the same time, we've even seen what's happened with AJ Brown in the Arthur Smith offense, where he's been able to be a top 15 wide receiver as a rookie and as a second-year player with Ryan Tannehill. And so I think there's going to be some similarities. And just taking a look back at last year with George Pickens, he had a 22% target share last year. That was with Diontae Johnson on the field. And now with Diontae Johnson gone, that leaves behind roughly 18% target share. That's going to be split around. How do I say this nicely? A less than stellar wide receiver depth chart on the Steelers, Dave. I'm going to read off some of these names here. We've got rookie Roman Wilson, who likely ends up playing in the slot. Fine player. I like him plenty. Then you got Van Jefferson, who was with Arthur Smith and the Falcons last season, and he averaged 1 reception per game. So that's nice. Marquez Callaway, Calvin Austin, Quez Watkins, Scotty Miller, and the ghost of Denzel Mims. All of these guys are Steelers wide receivers, and it wouldn't surprise me if they make a move and maybe add someone. But for now, George Pickens is kind of the guy. Yeah, he's kind of the guy here, and I look at this in the 4 games last season without Diontae Johnson, and it's going to be probably something similar. Pickens was averaging a 28% target share, which is nuts, averaging 90 receiving yards per game. He was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver in 2 of those 4 games. It's a very, very small sample size. I'm not trying to, get it like you say, get over our skis with this, but George Pickens is a talented player, and Russell Wilson is still a talented quarterback. And for all the hate that we give Arthur Smith, he has the ability to run an offense, I guess, a little bit. They could score some points. There can be some fantasy relevant players here. We know Russ loves the deep ball. He's had success with Cortland Sutton last year, DK Metcalf in years earlier. George Pickens matches what Russ likes to do. His 18.1 yards per reception led the NFL last season. So it just seems like a perfect marriage, but there's a little bit of the Arthur Smith stink on there.
Yeah, I like George Pickens. I've come around to him after his rookie season. I was a big fan of the prospect that got drafted, and then there were so many glaring red
Yeah.
flags after his rookie year. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I want to say he was like 87th in targets per route run or something like that. And
Yeah,
the
not great.
inability to draw targets is concerning. It still wasn't great last year, but he improved that. Looking right now to 20.4, which was 45th best in the league. But like you said, in the games without Diontae Johnson, we saw that jump even more. So the range of outcomes for George Pickens is vast. He could be the next type of DK Metcalf type of player where he can be, a high end wide receiver 2, low end wide receiver 1, have his big games, but it's also possible that he's the next kind of Gabe Davis where he's got these big plays, but he just disappears in other games. I'd like to see his ability to draw targets grow a little bit. But like you said, somebody needs to catch passes in Pittsburgh. And that's kind of a flawed logic in pass where we've said that before, who's going to catch the passes, but really like they're going to need to throw the ball. They're going to be playing from behind. George Pickens is the wide receiver 1 here. A lot of the argument you made for Pickens, I can also apply to Pat Fryermuth, a guy that I
Mhm.
like after even coming off of a disappointing injury plague season last year. I think the passing offense very much so funnels through those two, George Pickens and Pat Fryermuth. So I find myself drafting both of them quite a bit. And really for Pickens, it's the upside. There is undeniable downside that he just continues to be a guy that struggles to draw targets and is a boomer bust type of player, but it's also in the range of outcomes that he could be a very good wide receiver 1 in this league.
I was the same with you and George Pickens. I absolutely loved the prospect. I loved the potential. And what I'm doing is like right now I'm kind of playing the hits. I'm rewinding, going back through my head here and remembering how much of the nonsense and shenanigans going on in that Steelers offense was Matt Canada just
Mhm.
simply not drawing up plays. Like how many times did we see those silly charts where we would only see throws to the outside of the field and 10 to 15 yards deep? There was no variety to the routes. There's no variety to the offense. It was just Kenny Pickett roll this way and throw 10 to 15 yards towards the sideline. And that was it. And so a lot of it was let's just get George Pickens to win on contested catches. And that was tough. And I pulled up Matt Harmon's reception perception over here, which, by the way, if you're not subscribed, go check that out. It's a phenomenal tool for those of you who want to see how good your favorite wide receivers actually are. Matt Harmon's a former football guy, so go and support him. But I'm looking at the route percentage here for George Pickens, and the only 2 routes that are green on how often he ran them were corner routes, where you're hitting the deep center of the field where the safety is, and then 23% of his routes were 9
Nice.
routes,
Yep.
which is just a straight go ball down the field.
That's what he does
Everything else
best.
that was sure, that's what he does best, but I mean, when you're the defense and you know it's coming, and you know that the offense that you're going against has a quarterback that can't hit that route, yeah, it gets a little easy to defend those. So what I'm hoping for here is we get to see a little bit more of that play action with Arthur Smith. We get to see something that's going to be have a little bit more variety here, and then still get the explosive plays that we get from those 9 routes.
And I want to say too, like George Pickens has great yards after the catch ability, and we didn't see a lot of that last year because of the usage. So I'm hoping they could see that this year. I don't want to make the comp to Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase, better prospect, all that we know, but like the game breaking ability on single plays where he can take a screen or a slant and then rip off 80 yards after the catch, that's something that very few players in the league can do. And that's why when I mentioned DK Metcalf earlier, Jamar Chase, George Pickens has that type of profile where he can be that game breaking player. I would just like to see the ball go to him a little bit more consistently than what we've seen through his first 2 years in the league.
Yeah, there's definitely some upside, but there's definitely still some concern. I think I think if we're going to see George Pickens somewhere, I don't think we're going to see him as high as we're seeing right now. I think in home league drafts, he might go probably around 6 and probably closer to wide receiver 30. If he's there, I'm absolutely willing to take the chance on him being drafted as my wide receiver 3 because I think he can absolutely beat that average draft position and return some value here.
And he's getting drafted right now as a wide receiver 3. Underdog's
Yeah.
ADP right now has him at wide receiver 28. That's kind of what you're looking for. There's no sure things at that point in the draft. You're not drafting a guy hoping to get 8 points a week. You're hoping for a guy that you're drafting in round 6, 7, 8 that can just vastly outperform his ADP, and that's exactly what Pickens can do.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about this because I know that I want to do an episode in the future where we talk about consistency, maybe versus volatility, and talk about how some of the safest and most consistent players don't necessarily actually help you win, but
Mhm.
people love it. People love it, and what you're saying is 100% true. Like when you get to that wide receiver 3 range, find the players that bring you that week winning volatility because those it's in the name. Those are the players that are going to win you your week. So, yeah, I'm in here with George Pickens on this, especially if the price is going to be there. Dave, take us to the next guy that we got here, and it's a player that we've talked about a ton. It's a guy that we both really like. It's an offense that we both really like, and it may not even be the last Buffalo Bill that we talk about today. But you want to talk about Dalton Kincaid, tight end for the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, we talked about this guy a lot last preseason. We talked about him throughout the offseason or throughout the season, and you've talked about him quite a bit this offseason. Now it's my turn to talk about him a little bit. Since we're talking about opportunities, the opportunity is absolutely there for Dalton Kincaid. I'm going to talk a little bit about his usage. I think tight end usage is probably one of the most important metrics that you can look at. Typically, when we see tight ends who are lining up in line, hand in the dirt, blocking, that's not what we want to see. That doesn't bode well for fantasy production. We want to see the guys who are running a lot of routes, lining up in the slot, lining up out wide. And last year, only Mark Andrews had a higher slot rate than Dalton Kincaid did when you look at tight ends who pulled 50 plus targets. Now, that slot rate also jumped weeks 1 through 10 when Ken Dorsey was the offensive coordinator. Dalton Kincaid saw 51.2% of his snaps out of the slot. After Joe Brady took over, that jumped from 51.2% to 65.5%. Again, still second highest in the league behind only Mark Andrews. Now, why is that slot rate important? Because historically, we've seen Josh Allen loves to pepper his wide receivers with targets out of the slot. Just look at Cole Beasley, 3 straight years with 100 plus targets out of the slot from 2019 to 2021. They haven't really had a guy to facilitate that role since. And I know Dalton Kincaid is technically a tight end, but his role in this offense is more of a slot receiver than anything else. He's just one of the few tight ends who has the opportunity to lead his team in targets. With Stephon Diggs out of the picture right now, that opens up an opportunity for 9.8 targets per game. That's what Stephon Diggs has pulled since he joined the Bills in 2020. And I like some other guys there. Khalil Shakir is my favorite. Find myself drafting a lot of him. But you look at Keon Coleman, he's not a guy, he's a lot like George Pickens, who we just talked about. He's not a guy who's going to be pulling 150 plus targets. He's going to be making some big plays. He's going to be a presence near the end zone. Curtis Samuel, fun player, but he's kind of shown us who he is at this point in his career. I'm not expecting him to suddenly be a 150 target type of player. Dawson Knox, very traditional tight end. I said we want to avoid those guys that line up in line. That's what Dawson Knox does. He's going to be blocking a lot. He's going to be a red zone threat. But Kincaid is the guy who realistically has a chance to lead his team in targets. The last thing I'll say, again, going back to the alignment here, when you combine playing in the slot and out wide, the other option would be playing inline. There were only 2 players who lined up less frequently inline than Dalton Kincaid did last year. Mark Andrews, who we already talked about, and Kyle Pitts, who we talk about all the time, is basically being a wide receiver with a TE next to his name on the depth chart. That is exactly what Dalton Kincaid is. When you look at his alignment, where he lines up on the field, the types of routes that he runs, there's kind of 2 comps that jump out to me. Evan Ingram and his usage is in Jacksonville, where he's been a top 5 tight end in back-to-back years, and then Darren Waller, what we saw during his time in the Raiders, where he was just
Too
a
soon.
menace in fantasy football. That's kind of what we're seeing with Dalton Kincaid. He is that type of player where he is just going to be running a ton of routes. He can be a target hog. It is very likely that we see him finish inside the top 5 this year as a tight end.
Yeah, I'm with you on every single statement here about Dalton Kincaid, and I've been banging the drum for him this whole off season, and talked about how we just get a little bit of touchdown variance, and he
Mhm.
is exactly where Sam Laporta was.
Yep.
Just everything was nearly identical, and the interesting thing here too, Dave, and I know that a lot of commenters, viewers, listeners, whatever, will be thinking, okay, this is great that these players have opportunity, but can they actually earn the targets? The good news is that Dalton Kincaid was doing that. He was already earning targets. He was getting a lot of those first read looks in this offense. And so now all we do is we vacate more and more and more targets. And listen, I think that Dalton Kincaid not only has a chance to be a top 5 tight end, but I think he can be one of those guys that's competing with Travis Kelsey and Mark Andrews and Trey McBride and Sam Laporta and all these guys to be tight end 1. And I think he's probably the last guy that I think has that tight end 1 overall potential. Maybe Kyle Pitts as well. Maybe Kyle Pitts sneaks in there as the 6th, but I think that Dalton Kincaid is firmly in that conversation going into
Yeah.
2024.
And last year, I mean, the biggest problem for Dalton Kincaid was his inability to get on the field. He's still pretty raw at the position and he's learning it. He only played about 65% of the snaps for the Bills last year, which ranked 23rd among tight ends. But despite only playing 65% of the snaps, he was 8th in targets among all tight ends. So when he was on the field, he was drawing targets. Like you said, that's the concern. Can he do it? He already did it. And now there's just a huge opening for him to take on an even bigger role in the offense.
Yeah, and we forget too how long it used to take tight ends to actually get on the field
Mhm.
and be productive. Tight ends one of the hardest positions outside of quarterback, but one of the hardest positions to learn and assimilate to the NFL because you are lining up in line, in the slot, out wide, you're blocking, you're running various choice routes, you're doing so many different things. You need to be a security blanket for your quarterback. And if you're not ready to do that, you don't get on the field. The fact that Dalton Kincaid and Sam Laporta and these guys were able to do this early in their career speaks to how incredibly talented they are. And I think it only goes up from there.
Well, I think the good news for Kincaid is they don't ask him to do all those things. He wasn't blocking, he
Right.
wasn't lining up in line. They were basically like, it's you can go back to Jimmy Graham and his usage. Like I said, with Mark Andrews, Darren Waller, Evan Ingram, these guys, like you never see Mike Gesicki out there blocking and sealing an end for a rush. Like he is just out there specifically to run a route and catch passes, and that's exactly what we're going to see from Dalton Kincaid through his career.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean like he was being forced to block, but more
Right,
so of that there are a lot of nuances to the
of course.
position as to where you're lining up. And like and what you said is 100% true. He's still learning the position. He has not played it very long, going back to his days in college. All right, I'm going to get us to our next guy. And, it's funny. We already talked about one Steelers receiver. This is a guy who was a Steelers receiver, but now headed to the Carolina Panthers. And I'm talking about Diontae Johnson, who this is a guy that I think the video has circulated around quite a bit of him about how the Panthers really wanted to go and get him specifically for their team. The offensive coordinator, Brad Idzik, told Dave Canales they needed an X receiver. They needed to go get a guy that defenses could respect, that he could be the target hog for this team and help Bryce Young. And that video has been circulating around social media. And I listen, I'm weary of following any type of video that the Panthers release on social media. They did this last year with Miles Sanders and told us that they wanted to get him in the receiving game and get him involved, and that didn't work that great. But whole new staff, different type of player. What I love here is that Diontae Johnson, who honestly I think might just be better than George Pickens, the guy I mentioned earlier, is going 2 rounds later and as the wide receiver 39 for average draft position, which is just fantastic. You're nearly getting him as a wide receiver 4 cost because I think, one, I think people are just kind of off of him after last year. And two, most people, especially in your home leagues, are not going to be that excited about him being on the Panthers. But if we throw away last season where Diontae Johnson was averaging just 6.5 targets per game, it's an awful season for the Steelers, not very indicative of Diontae Johnson. We kind of already saw what worst case scenario is in 2022, where you get Kenny Pickett and Mitch Trubisky and a bad offense where guess what? He was the wide receiver 39. So we're getting him at the cost of his absolute worst case scenario where he scored 0 touchdowns. I don't foresee that as something that could happen here. I mean, it might. The Panthers might still be really bad, but the idea here is that the Panthers are a much improved offense. This is a guy who's going to be earning plenty of targets when he was in good situations with Ben Roethlisberger and even old Ben Roethlisberger, where the offense was just decent. Diontae Johnson was a top 24 wide receiver. He was even a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy. And I mentioned reception perception earlier in terms of George Pickens. When you look at the success by route for Diontae Johnson, Dave, every single route for Diontae Johnson is green. This is a guy that gets open. He wins on routes regardless of coverage. And that is something that the Carolina Panthers did not have last year. They were one of the worst wide receiver cores in terms of separation, which is why Adam Thielen became this target hog, because he was sort of the forgotten guy running around in the slot. And he was the only one they could actually get the ball to. And he ended up being a wide receiver 10 in points per game for the first 11 weeks. So you get a guy like Diontae who can play outside, he can play inside, he can move all over the field, and he gets open for a young quarterback and a very smart head coach, an up and coming offensive system. I love the fit. I really love the cost, and I think the potential is just sky high here for a guy who's just going to get tons of opportunity in 2024.
Yeah, when you watch this guy play, he's just on an island, open all the
Yeah.
time, and the struggles have been drops and yards after the catchability. I mean, I think this is like the only guy in the league that has like negative yards after the catch. Like he catches the ball and then immediately like runs back towards the quarterback inexplicably. But he is, like you said, this is the type of player you want to see with a young quarterback. A guy who could just get open immediately off the line, get open at every level of the field. Scott Barrett just tweeted this out a few days ago. But if you look at ESPN's open score, where they kind of use data to see how good wide receivers are at getting open, he was 12th best last year. The year before, he was fourth best. Or I'm sorry, the year before, he was best in the league. The year before, fourth. The year before that, third. The year before that, second. So from 2019 to 2022, he consistently ranked inside the top four, being one of the most open receivers in the league. Last year, he saw a little bit of a dip down to 12th best, but he was able to improve his yards after the catchability. And he actually scored some touchdowns, and he didn't drop the ball as much as he had in years past. So he's still a relatively young player, 28 years old, I believe. He's still got years in the tank. Reminds me a lot of Tyler Lockett, where he's got that skill set that's going to help him have a long career because he avoids the big hits. He avoids the contact. He's just a technician as a route runner. We should still see years ahead of him, and we're seeing him develop into a more well-rounded player at this point in his career. So completely with you. I can bore you with the numbers, but every guy you've talked about so far is a guy in these best ball drafts that I've been doing on Underdog that I am almost double exposure, or have double the exposure of the field to. Looking right now, I have drafted Diontae Johnson in about 1 in 6 of my drafts so far, which he figures twice as much as he's getting drafted by a normal user.
All I'm going to say is this: is if there was a moment last year where everyone wanted to start Adam Thielen as a wide receiver 2 or better
Mm-hmm.
in that terrible offense, this is a better wide receiver and likely a better offense and a better year for this quarterback. And the value is just incredible. I really love it. Now, before we go on to the next player that we've got here, I just want to remind you guys, you can go back and check out all of our other episodes that we've done here. We've gone through our positional rankings of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, tight ends. We've talked about sleepers with JJ Zacharyson. We've done breakouts. We've done a mock draft. We've got over 8 hours of fantasy football content here on the new YouTube channel, and just over these last 4 or 5 weeks here, Dave. So we've got tons of content for you guys to go back and check out, and we're going to be doing this all throughout the summer. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel and to the podcast. Dave, next up on this list is another player who we both really like. We have both drafted plenty of. I think there's a small reason to be worried, but that kind of risk gets baked into any player, and it's still kind of there in terms of his average draft position. But talk to us about Zamir White and the massive opportunity that he has in front of him.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like a bigger truther in the fantasy football industry when it comes to Zamir White than myself. I've been pounding the table for this guy for years. We finally saw it in a little taste last year, 4 games, and it was just lovely. In those 4 games that he started down the stretch last year when Josh Jacobs was injured, averaged 24.3 opportunities per game, 114.3 scrimmage yards per game. I mean, that's doesn't get better than that. That's elite usage, like truly, not just using the word loosely here. That is elite usage. He's built to be a 3-down back, 6 foot, 214 pounds, 96 percentile speed score. This guy is big. He's fast. Two big things that we want to see for running backs. And if you look at the opportunities that he saw last year, 24.3 opportunities per game, pretty similar to what we've seen Josh Jacobs get during his time with the Raiders, where he saw 21.4 opportunities per game. Now, obviously, we know Antonio Pierce, the head coach there, is going to want to run the ball, and there isn't a ton of competition for for touches. Alexander Madison was pretty terrible last year. I think
You're
his
not worried
QB.
about Alexander Madison?
I'm
You're
I'm
not?
not. No, I
You
kind of
sure?
joked when the signing was announced. I said, "This is good news for Zamir
It
White
is.
because Madison was pretty bad last year, to put it lightly." You've got Amir Abdullah and Dylan Lobby there. That probably poses more of a threat to Zamir White than Madison does because they are both good passing down backs, and that could cap his upside a little bit. But if you look last year over those 4 games that Zamir White started, he averaged 3.3 targets per game, which is pretty impressive for any running back. And in the one loss that he played in, he pulled 6 targets, which is great passing game usage. So a lot of those games that we saw last year, they were in the lead and they weren't asking the running backs to catch the ball. But at the one time they were playing from behind, Zamir White was plenty involved in the passing game. So it's possible that we see that kind of it was necessary last year because they didn't have anybody else, and it's possible that this year we see Abdullah and Lobby a little bit more involved in the passing game. But we saw last year that White does have the ability to run out of the backfield and catch the ball. So really, we're talking about opportunity on this show. There's a huge opportunity here. Zamir White, when you start doing projections, projects for a huge workload. We could easily see him hit that like 250 carries, 50 plus targets. If he does that, that volume alone would push him into top 10 running back status. If he scores some touchdowns, if this Las Vegas offense is suddenly a little bit better than last year, maybe Gardner Minshew takes over and can facilitate a better passing offense, which opens up the run game. There's a lot of avenues here where Zamir White could just absolutely smash his ADP. And I guess the risk here is that he has like a low ceiling, but that ceiling could so easily be swayed by touchdowns and unexpected work in the passing game. All of that is baked into his ADP. Right now, Zamir White is getting drafted as the RB23. You're drafting him as a back end RB2. And if the volume does fall his way, and if he's able to score some touchdowns, he can easily outperform that RB23 price tag.
Now there's a few running backs this year that all have massive opportunity. And whether we're talking about Zamir White, and these are new guys, right? Like Zach Moss is another one who's been brought up. And then this next player that I want to talk about, Devin Singletary. What I'm so interested in with these players is, when do we know that we're not getting Alexander Madison? Is it simply looking at these players and saying he is talented, so it's not going like he's better than Madison? Because the stars had really aligned for a guy like Madison last year, and the stars had aligned for guys like Mike Davis in the past. And so, when you're a fantasy football manager, how are you looking at these guys and saying, you know what, I think the upside is there. This guy is the juice is worth the squeeze. It's worth the risk. Let me wait and I can get one of these guys like a Zamir White or Zach Moss or the guy I'm going to talk about in just a second here, Devin Singletary.
It's funny you mentioned that. I tweeted out last offseason. I'm looking at the date right now, August 21st, 2023. So right before the season got kicked off. And I got a ton of flack for this. I tweeted 2021, we had Mike Davis. In 2022, we had Chase Edmonds. And in 2023, we have Alexander Madison. And what it is, those are 3 guys who projected for big workloads that weren't good running backs. You look at the efficiency metrics and they just flat out were not good with the opportunity when they had it. Zamir White isn't that. When you look, Zamir White is an efficient running back. He breaks tackles, he makes yards after contact, he's able to find the creases and pick up yards before contact as well. He's able to juke defenders. He can do all of the things that those guys couldn't do. So I saw the writing on the wall last year with Madison just because he had some exciting efficiency metrics early in his career and in year 1 and year 2. And then we saw that efficiency quickly start trending down. And a lot of people were so infatuated by the early career metrics and they held on to him in Dynasty for years. And they were hoping that his opportunity was going to kind of come, that they ignored the dip in efficiency over the years. Zamir White is still young. He hasn't seen any dip in efficiency. He is a more efficient runner than all those guys that we've compared him to. So I'm not especially worried about Zamir White.
I think it'll be interesting to see because I do like Zamir White as well, but I know there are people screaming into the void right now that a 4-game sample size. So it's kind of hard to lose efficiency through the 4 games. And that's kind of the same things that we saw from a lot of these guys in the past. And I know that'll be the argument for all these guys we talk about, whether it's Devin Singletary, who I'm about to talk about now, or Zach Moss or Zamir White. It's going to be small sample size. You don't know if you can trust them. I'll say this. To me, one of the things that I want to look for is obviously it's going to be the sample size, which is why I do like Devin Singletary here. Um, it's going to be such a cop out, Dave, but I think I agree with you that it's just easy to look at a player and say he's good at football. He's good at football, and with these teams where they don't have a lot invested into a running back like an Alexander Madison or a Zach Moss or whatever, they can move on pretty quickly. But I think that when we just look at them and you watch them play, you kind of have to make the eye test for yourself and say Zamir White was really good with the limited opportunities he had and weigh that against the cost associated in drafts. Whereas I think if I remember correctly, Alexander Madison was going a bit higher than where Zamir White is going right now.
And
And
I think
for
the
every
discount for Zamir White is because of everyone that got Madison last year.
right, well, and you know what too is like let's talk really quick on the side here. We talk about efficiency and how it wanes. We've seen reduced efficiency from Alvin Kamara, from Joe Mixon. The difference is that those guys were established. But for every Alexander Madison you have, you get a Rashad White who finishes as a top 12 running back, who was not a good runner, but got tons of opportunity. And so you do need to find players that can be efficient with the touches that they get and not easily supplanted. I think that's the other thing too, is not easily supplanted by whoever's behind them.
So
And
let me
and that's
just
why
read off. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
go for it. No, go.
I want to read off this final stat. I was looking for it. It took me a second, but I was able to find it. Last year, the most yards after contact per attempt for running backs with minimum 100 carries. So we're looking at a huge sample here. Most yards after contact per attempt. Devon Achane, number one. Jonathan Taylor, number two. Jameer Gibbs, number three. David Montgomery, number four. Zamir White, number five. So that's what I would look for. That's one of my favorite efficiency metrics. Can you generate yards after somebody gets your hand on you? And Zamir White proved that he was able to do that last year. On top of that, he was also 16th in the league in breakaway run rate for running backs. So this guy's fast, he breaks tackles, and he's going to have a huge opportunity on his plate. What's not to like?
Yeah. There's going to be plenty to like with all of these players. And one of the guys that I want to talk about here is Devin Singletary. I've been kind of dropping his name, a little Devin Singletary breadcrumbs here because he seems to be the guy I skipped over was Zach Moss, because Zach Moss still has Chase Brown there in the
Mhm.
backfield. And as much as we liked Zach Moss last year, Devin Singletary does not have a Chase Brown. And I know there are Tyrone Tracy truthers out there that are screaming that Tracy can be something great. And I'm sure he can. But we're also talking about a guy in Tyrone Tracy who has not played a lot of running back. And there's still quite a bit to learn to make it a little bit more natural in the league. And Dave, something you love to point out all the time is that Brian Dable loves Devin Singletary. And there is a familiarity with him. And the contract that they gave Singletary makes him the clear RB1 in this offense. And what I love right now is that you can get him as the running back 33 in fantasy football drafts, and you're getting him in around 9. This is a guy that you could probably plug in as your RB2, and you're able to get him as the potentially 9th player on your roster, which is just nuts. And I know there's going to be tons of concern about the Giants as an offense. And I have those same concerns. But the way I kind of look at it here is if we are willing to like the target volume and the void of playmakers and say Malik Neighbors has a really good shot of getting tons of volume in this offense and making it work for him, then we kind of have to like the potential for volume for Devin Singletary too. I'm not saying they're the same players. Malik Neighbors obviously is a much better player in his own right for his respective position, but Devin Singletary is no slouch. He's a guy that we've seen actually produce. And when we actually see him with Brian Dable in Buffalo, he averages 62% snap share. It would have been top 15 last year if we were using the same numbers going into last year's fantasy football season. He was a top 24 fantasy running back in nearly half his games with Brian Dable. And mind you, that's with Josh Allen there. A team that's passing a ton. Josh Allen, who's stealing a lot of touchdowns, a lot of rushing yards, and really not passing the ball a whole bunch to his running backs early on in his career. That's something that kind of changed now with Joe Brady being there. So I do get it. I get that there's the bad offense, but there are a lot of positives here for Devin Singletary. And we looked just last year when he was in a pretty solid offense, and he got the opportunities. I say solid. The Houston Texans were a very good offense, but when he got the opportunity from week 10 on last year, he was a running back 9 with a guy that was seeing 20 plus opportunities per game. Will he reach 20 plus opportunities per game with the Giants? I don't know. I don't necessarily think so, but I don't think that you're drafting him to be the running back 9. If he's anywhere within that stratosphere, it's a very pleasant surprise. But this is a guy that you're able to draft as running back 33, and he could potentially return running back 20 value on a guy who's going to be getting, let's say, 18 to 20 touches in a game. I know that might sound crazy, but he's been doing that. He's been doing that. He's been used in the passing game. And man, guys, I don't know. Maybe the best thing for the Giants might be to not even have Daniel Jones as a starter. Drew Lock being in there could lead to some easy dump offs for Devin Singletary. So there's absolutely, Dave, we'd like to say it, there's a world where Devin Singletary is a locked and loaded RB2 throughout the season, and you get him at this massive discount because of the opportunity for volume.
Yeah, Devin Singletary is kind of an enigma. You look at it like there's nothing about his profile that I'm especially excited about. Like
Oh,
he's undersized, he's unathletic, like the efficiency metrics haven't been there, but he's kind of like the anti DeAndre Swift. Like we get so enamored by DeAndre Swift because he's big, he's fast, he does all these exciting things, you flash him the efficiency profile, but then head coaches hate him because he does a lot of the wrong things and can't find the right gaps and doesn't pick up yards after the catch and dances a little bit too much east and west. Devin Singletary is the opposite. Like nothing in his profile screams that he should be a good running back, but he does all of those little things that keep him in the coach's good graces. He always hits the gap. He's able to just churn those legs for the extra half yard when he needs to. And coaches, and Brian Dable especially, love that about him. So I'm not going to sit here and nitpick it. You kind of talked about a lot of the red flags with Devin Singletary and his profile and his team situation and all that. And that's obviously baked into his ADP, but the upside is absolutely there. Like you said, this guy just continues to get volume wherever he goes. And I think that opportunity is going to be there in New York.
yeah, it's important for us to keep that context. So this is not every single player here is one where we say he's going to be an absolute breakout star, top 12 at his position. That's not how it works, but we are saying that these players have massive opportunities in front of them, and it's not quite reflected in their average draft position. And that's where you win drafts, is just by finding value after value after value.
And I also want to
Dave,
point out, you
yeah.
started off talking about Devin Singletary, talking about Zach Moss a little bit. And
Mhm.
Zach Moss is one of those guys that I've liked, and I find myself drafting, and the opportunity is going to be there for him in Cincinnati. But he does have a lot of the same red flags that we talked about with Alexander Madison earlier. If you look, yards after contact per attempt, trending down every single year. He had a career low missed tackle rate last year as well. So all of the efficiency metrics that we liked about Zach Moss early in his career are quickly trending down. I think the kind of saving grace for Zach Moss might be the fact that Joe Mixon also had a dwindling efficiency profile and still was able to churn out RB1 production in Cincinnati. But Zach Moss definitely has a lot of those red flags that a lot of these dead zone running backs, like, yeah, he's not that good, but he's going to get the volume. He kind of has that sort of tag on him right now. So I like Zach Moss and I've been drafting him, but it's very possible that he busts at his current ADP.
Oh, and the Bengals have their own little Ty Chandler there with Chase Brown, a guy who can
Exactly.
get
Yep.
involved in the passing game. So,
Yep.
that's I think if I was looking at these 3, I'd probably go with Zamir White first, Devin Singletary, a little like a tier down, and then Zach Moss probably in the same tier as Singletary, but at the very, very bottom of that tier. He's kinda like my desperation RB2 if I went
Yeah.
very wide receiver heavy everywhere else.
Yep.
All right. Let's get to our final 2 players here, Dave. You've got Hollywood Brown on this list, and it feels like we do it every year where we're like, okay, this Chiefs receiver is going to do it. And we haven't really seen an instance like this where we've seen a guy be good on 2 different offenses, 2 different quarterbacks, maybe not necessarily a world beater, top 12 type wide receiver, but we know he's got talent and he is a good fit for this offense. So Hollywood Brown going to the Chiefs, the opportunity might be, we don't know. It could be even bigger than we think, depending on what happens with Rashee Rice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll push back and on your not a world beater comment there and say that he absolutely could be a top 12 receiver. I mean, we haven't seen it at this point in his career, but
Well, that's what I'm saying. He
everything is
hasn't done
underlying.
it, but he
Right. everything in his profile tells us that he could be, though. I mean, if you look at an efficiency basis and the ability to pull targets, targets per route run, yards per route run, all those fun metrics, his entire time in Baltimore, he was basically a top 10 receiver. It's just that was early in Lamar Jackson's career when he was throwing the ball like 19 times per game and it wasn't translating into production. When we did see it finally come together, when DeAndre Hopkins was suspended in Arizona for that 6 game stretch, Hollywood Brown was the wide receiver 4 in fantasy scoring. I mean, he was absolutely crushing it and then got injured and then got injured again the next year. So we saw this like little taste of what Hollywood Brown could look like in a pass first offense with a good quarterback. And the results were unbelievable. And now, I've dropped this on the show before, this stat, but it just blows my mind that like how the Chiefs had to utilize their receivers last year. They had their underneath guys and they had their deep guys. That was it. You didn't have anybody who could run a diverse route tree. Every single wide receiver ran either a sub 10-yard average target depth or a plus 17-yard average target depth. They had MVS and Justin Watson stretching the field, and then they had Rashee Rice and Kadarius Toney and Sky Moore and everybody else working underneath. And what they've been looking for since trading Tyreek Hill is a guy that can do both. And you look, that's exactly what Hollywood Brown can do. He can do both. He can win deep, he can win short, he can win outside, he can win across the middle of the field. He can run every single route and he can run them all well. This is another stat that I came across when kind of doing this dig that blew my mind. Rashee Rice, in his game with his highest target depth last year, was lower than Hollywood Brown's lowest target depth over the course of an entire season. So, I mean, Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice, if you're looking at them as potentially cannibalizing each other, that's just not where you want to think about this wide receiver room at because they operate in very different parts of the field. If anything, they should benefit each other and help open up more opportunities for Hollywood Brown. Now, the other thing I'll say is I think people are starting to catch on to this a little bit. It was about 2 months ago that I started like really pounding the drum for Hollywood Brown. And at that time, Xavier Worthy was getting drafted ahead of Marquise Brown. That has since flip flopped. And now Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown, I think he officially changed his name to Hollywood Brown because I saw it get changed on Sleeper and Underdog. So Hollywood
Is
Brown
that is
is more
that like
referred to him.
government official? I thought it was just sleeper official. I didn't think it was government official.
I don't know. Sleeper and Underdog both made the change. So maybe he went to the DMV and made that change. But we'll refer to him as Hollywood Brown for
Is
the
that
rest
where
of
you
the
go? You go to the
offseason.
DMV to change your name?
I think so. That's where my wife went
That
after we got
seems like
married.
that seems like the stupidest thing. Like, why do you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to change your name?
That's
It's
where
like going
they
to the
keep
grocery
you
store to get
records.
an oil change. Like, you're just going to different places for no reason.
I guess so. Well,
America, you're awesome. All
Hollywood
right, keep
Brown.
going.
That's what we'll
Yeah.
refer to him as. I just think he's got this opportunity to kind of fulfill that role that was left by Tyreek Hill. Now, I'm not saying Hollywood Brown is as good of a wide receiver as Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is probably the best in the league right now, but they play similar roles where they can do everything, catch any pass, run every route, yards after the catch, win deep, contested catches, all that sort of stuff. So I think it is very much so in the range of Hollywood Brown that he can be a top 10, even a top 5 receiver as that guy that we have been looking for years in Kansas City that can do more than one thing. They're not asking him to do what Rashee Rice does and run a slant and a screen on every play. They're not asking him to do what MVS does and run a 9 route on every single play. They're going to be able to move this guy all over the formation, keep defenses on their toes. And I think the ceiling for Hollywood Brown is so much higher than his ADP currently reflects.
I will agree with that 100%. And I do think one of the pieces that I really like about Hollywood Brown here is that he does have the diversity in his route tree that he can be the deep threat like we've seen him. He can also be the quick screen guy. I think that once all three receivers and Travis Kelsey are in here, I think that's where my worry becomes a little bit. Now we could sit here and we could say, hey, Xavier Worthy, it's going to take some time. We've seen that with rookie wide receivers every year for the Chiefs. When Rashee Rice is there, Dave, we haven't talked about this enough. I'm not a big Rashee Rice fan. I don't know that the
Very
production we saw
gimmicky.
fantasy football wise is something that translates to being a good NFL player. We saw a guy who could not win. Same thing that we saw in college. Like he could not win on routes, but he was good when he got the ball in his hands. And it almost just seemed like a guy who was getting production because of the environment around him. He was the de facto wide receiver. That was it. What I'm intrigued here is Hollywood Brown is kind of the jack of all trades that works for the Chiefs there. The big thing is, can he be healthy? And how long is this Rashee Rice suspension going to be? how big of a role does Travis Kelce and Xavier Worthy still maintain? I would venture to say Travis Kelce is probably still going to be the number one target on this team, but what does Xavier Worthy turn into? And I think that'll be the interesting thing to see. But you're 1,000% right here. Hollywood Brown should, as long as he's healthy, crush his ADP. Like just be an absolute value here with the opportunity.
Let me put you on the spot real quickly. I'll throw
Sure.
a fun little quiz at you.
I hate.
Lowest ADOT, average depth of target in the NFL last year. What wide receiver do you
Oh,
think had the lowest ADOT?
oh, it was Rashee Rice.
You're close. It was Kadarius Toney. But guess who had the second
Mm,
lowest ADOT?
Rashee Rice, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, these guys were so limited in what they could do. And it's just like their offense. When you watch them last year, it was unbelievable. Like you knew exactly what was coming. It was either MVS or Justin Watson on the outside, and they were running deep to try to pull defenses out a little bit. Travis Kelsey going across the middle of the field, and then Tony and Rice on the outside, just literally like the ball would snap and they would just turn and look at Patrick Mahomes and just hope the ball was coming in their direction. Like they weren't running routes. It was slants and screens. That's basically all Rashee Rice was able to do last year. So the production was great. You look at the yards per route run, targets per route run, that was great. But I get kind of concerned if you can't do anything more than 5 yards off the line of scrimmage.
And Sky Moore still couldn't break out. Which, by the way, that's actually like what he was good at in college, is catching those
I know.
screens and being able to run after the catch. That is infuriating. All right, let's go to the final guy here, wide receiver that I've just absolutely had a crush on throughout his career and in college coming out. Khalil Shakir, wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. And I remember being so frustrated, thinking, why can't he get on the field? This guy, he's got the goods. And now there is just a massive opportunity in front of him. And I get it. Like, he's not the biggest, he's not the fastest. There are always going to be guys that can be better weapons, right? But the opportunity that is laid in front of him this year is monumental. We already talked about how good it can be for Dalton Kincaid, but really outside of that, Keon Coleman, like you said, is a guy that's going to take some development. Curtis Samuel, we pretty much know what he is. He's going to be a slot and gadget guy, and he's going to be sharing that slot a little bit with Dalton Kincaid and going into the backfield and sharing that with James Cook. Whereas Khalil Shakir, listen, maybe a lot of people don't believe in it, but this is a guy that can actually go and play the X receiver for this team. He can do a lot of the same stuff that Diontae Johnson has done throughout his career, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get a lot of that over in Buffalo. Right now, the average draft position for Khalil Shakir is in the 11th round, going as the wide receiver 55. You've already mentioned that the Bills lost Stephon Diggs. They lost Gabe Davis. There's more than 50% of last year's targets just vacated and up for grabs. I know a lot of that's going to go to Dalton Kincaid. Some of it goes to Keon Coleman, some of it to Curtis Samuel, but this should be a massive increase for a guy like Khalil Shakir, who's just simply good at getting open. He can play anywhere on the field. He can win at all levels of the field. Listen, I just, I really, really like what he's able to do. I really like the fit. I really like specifically the fit with Joe Brady. Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator there, because he's always been a big yak guy, yak per reception. And Khalil Shakir, sorry, yak for those. I hate to use acronyms out here, but yards after the catch. But Khalil, man, struggling on this one. Khalil Shakir has been a guy who's been good at this throughout his career. He was third amongst wide receivers just behind Deebo Samuel and Rashee Rice, who we were just talking about last year. So we could see a lot of quick passes to Khalil Shakir and to Curtis Samuel. We could see Shakir winning a bit more downfield because there's going to be quite a bit of time here for Keon Coleman to develop, a guy who just doesn't have the route refinement that we want to see. And when we do look at the sample size of what he's been able to do, you take a look. Anytime that he's been at 60% snap share or more, he's averaged 4 catches for 61 yards. He was a wide receiver 3 or better in nearly 60% of his games where that happened. And so that was with, by the way, Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis being on the roster and playing. So it's not like this is a guy that hasn't been able to do it with talented players out there on the field. Now he's being drafted a full round later than any other wide receiver on the Bills. He's going around later than Curtis Samuel and Keon Coleman. And I get it. People see Keon Coleman and they say he's big, he's tall, he's fast, he's got a cool jacket, he's funny. Sure, let's draft him because he's the fancy new rookie. And we see Curtis Samuel and we say, okay, he was able to produce with Joe Brady in the past. Khalil Shakir's been doing it, guys. And now to be at wide receiver 55, outside of injury, it is so hard for me to imagine a world where he doesn't absolutely just smash that average draft position and give us something a bit closer to probably like a wide receiver 3, even just low end wide receiver 3. I'm not saying he's going to be a world beater, but where he's going right now and the opportunity he has in front of him, I'm drafting as much of him as possible.
There's also something to be said for he and Josh Allen just being on the same page. When you look last year, there are so many metrics that Khalil Shakir ranked best in the league at, and they aren't necessarily personal metrics. It's more what he did with his quarterback. Target quality rating, number one in the league, meaning like when he was on the field, Josh Allen was throwing better targets to Khalil Shakir than any other wide receiver was getting in the league. Target accuracy, number one in the league. Yards per target, number one in the league. QB rating per target, number one in the league. Fantasy points per target, number two in the league. Like he and Josh Allen are just speaking the same language right now. When they're out there, they are on the same page. Khalil Shakir gets deep downfield, which makes his targets more valuable. And Josh Allen is just hitting him in the breadbasket. So it's tough to say that those are going to like assuredly carry over into 2024. But we saw it last year in a little taste. And after Joe Brady took over, we saw people don't talk about it all that much. Like there was a dramatic shift in offensive philosophy overall starting in week 11. Like, everything kind of gets jumbled together when looking back in hindsight at the previous season. But there was that embarrassing loss in primetime to Denver. Ken Dorsey was fired. Joe Brady took over, and then it was just a different offense from there on out. They stopped force feeding the ball to Stephon Diggs. All of a sudden, all of these young guys, James Cook, Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, became more involved in the offense. They started pressing the ball deeper downfield. Josh Allen stopped running quite as much, started throwing the ball a little bit more. And I think we're going to see a lot of that carry over into 2024. I think it's crazy right now that Shakir is getting drafted behind these other guys you talked about, Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel. Looking at projections, I think Khalil Shakir easily could be the wide receiver one here. I think Dalton Kincaid is probably the de facto wide receiver one, even though he's technically a tight end. But I think that second in targets is easily going to be Shakir.
Yeah, all these players, like we've been saying, massive opportunity. Khalil Shakir, no different. All of these guys should be able to beat their average draft position and just be guys that can help you win your leagues. And that's what we're here to do. That's what we're going to keep going throughout the summer is finding players that can help you win your fantasy football leagues, get you ahead of the curve when it comes to the rest of your fantasy football league mates. And we'll be back again next week, Dave. We'll continue to keep talking more and more about these topics. And but before we head out here, I want to make sure you guys are all subscribed to the daily news updates from Football Guys. You get everything that you need to win in fantasy football. It's sent straight to you every day by Joe Bryant himself. And it's got a bunch of great news tidbits in there. And you'll see a lot of the articles that we've got from footballguys.com, and make sure you're subscribed there. But yeah, this has been a great episode. I'm glad we got to do this. I'm glad you're back from Hawaii. Well, let's keep things rolling. We'll keep things rolling next week. But for myself, for Dave, for everyone here at Football Guys, I want to thank you guys for watching, listening all the way through. We'll see you next time. Adios.